The gunshot that split the afternoon air wasn't what caught Preston Northwood's attention as he rode into Spokane, Washington, on that sweltering August day in 1882, but rather the woman stumbling out of the saloon's back door, clutching her side and leaving a trail of dusty footprints that spoke of desperation more than injury. He'd been riding for 3 days straight from Montana, delivering a herd of cattle to a buyer who'd paid top dollar, and his pockets were heavier than they had been in months. The main street of Spokane stretched before him, a mix of weathered wooden buildings and newer brick structures that spoke to the town's growing prosperity. The railroad had come through 2 years prior, bringing with it an influx of settlers, merchants, and, unfortunately, the kind of men who preyed on those less fortunate. Preston guided his horse toward the water trough outside the general store, his eyes tracking the woman as she pressed herself against the alley wall. She was young, maybe 23 or 24, with auburn hair that had come loose from its pins and hung in tangled waves around her shoulders. Her dress, once a respectable brown calico, was torn at the hem and covered in trail dust. But it was her eyes that held him, wide and green, and filled with a terror that made his chest tighten. He dismounted slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening. Years of working with skittish horses had taught him patience, and something about this woman reminded him of a mare he'd once gentled, all trembling legs and wild-eyed fear. "Madam," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "You all right?" She flinched at his voice, her hand flying to her throat in a defensive gesture that made him wonder what kind of hell she'd been through. Up close, he could see the hollows beneath her cheekbones, the way her dress hung loose on a frame that should have been fuller. Her lips were cracked from sun and dehydration, and when she tried to speak, only a hoarse whisper emerged. "I'm fine," she managed, but her legs chose that moment to buckle. Preston caught her before she hit the ground, his arms encircling a body that weighed far too little. She struggled weakly against his hold, but he could feel the tremors running through her, the way her breath came in short, panicked gasps. "Easy now," he murmured, the same tone he'd use with a frightened animal. "I'm not going to hurt you. When's the last time you ate something?" Her green eyes met his, and for a moment he saw past the fear, to a bone-deep exhaustion that spoke of weeks, maybe months, of hardship. Her lips trembled as she tried to form words, and he had to lean closer to hear her whispered response. "Tuesday." Preston's jaw tightened. Today was Friday. 3 days without food, probably longer without a proper meal. No wonder she could barely stand. He glanced around the street, noting the curious looks from passers-by, the way the saloon door remained firmly closed despite the earlier gunshot. Whatever trouble this woman was running from, the good people of Spokane weren't inclined to involve themselves. "There's a restaurant down the street," he said, keeping his voice gentle. "The Golden Pine. Best steak in Washington Territory, or so I've been told. What do you say we get you something to eat?" Suspicion warred with hunger in her eyes, and he could see her trying to calculate whether trusting him was more dangerous than her current situation. Her hands, he noticed, were shaking so badly she had to clasp them together to still them. "I don't have any money," she whispered, shame coloring her pale cheeks. "Didn't ask if you did." Preston straightened, still keeping one hand ready in case she swooned again. "I just asked if you wanted to eat." She stared at him for a long moment, searching his face for something. Whatever she found there must have satisfied her, because she gave a tiny nod. Preston offered his arm, and after a heartbeat's hesitation, she took it. He could feel how much she was leaning on him, using his strength to stay upright. They made their way down the wooden sidewalk, her steps unsteady, his deliberately slow to match her pace. The Golden Pine restaurant occupied a corner lot, its windows gleaming in the late afternoon sun. Through the glass, Preston could see white tablecloths and actual chairs, not just benches. It was the kind of place respectable families ate, not the rough-and-tumble establishments that catered to cowboys and miners. The proprietor, a stout man with impressive mutton chops, looked up as they entered. His expression shifted from welcome to disapproval as he took in the woman's disheveled appearance. "I'm sorry, but we have standards," he began. Preston's hand moved to his pocket, pulling out a gold double eagle that caught the light. "Table for two, somewhere private if you have it." The coin made the proprietor's objections evaporate. "Of course, sir. Right this way." They were led to a corner table, partially screened from the rest of the dining room by a decorative partition. Preston held out a chair for the woman, and she sank into it as though her strings had been cut. Her hands were still trembling as she placed them flat on the white tablecloth, and he could see her trying to will them steady. "Bring us 2 steak dinners," Preston told the proprietor, "with all the fixings, and coffee as hot, strong, and keep it coming." "Right away, sir." As the man hurried off, Preston settled into his own chair and studied the woman across from him. In the better light of the restaurant, he could see the bruises on her wrists, faded yellow-green, like they were a week or 2 old. There was a cut above her left eyebrow that was healing poorly, and when she reached for the water glass the waiter had left, he saw her wince. "Name's Preston," he said. "Preston Northwood. I'm a cattleman out of Montana, just finished a drive." She took a sip of water, then another, drinking it down like she'd been lost in the desert. When she finally set the glass down, some of the glassiness had left her eyes. "Eleanor," she replied, her voice still barely above a whisper. "Eleanor Taylor." "Well, Miss Taylor, I'm guessing you've got quite a story, but it can wait until you've got some food in you." Relief flickered across her face, and he realized she'd been bracing herself for an interrogation. The coffee arrived, and she wrapped both hands around the cup, breathing in the steam like it was the finest perfume. He noticed she didn't drink it right away, just held it, letting the warmth seep into her fingers. Preston sipped his own coffee and tried not to stare, but it was hard not to notice things. The way she kept glancing at the door like she expected someone to burst through it, the defensive hunch to her shoulders, the barely suppressed tremor that ran through her every few minutes. This was a woman who'd been running on fear and adrenaline for so long that her body didn't remember how to relax. The food came quickly, and Preston had to suppress a wince when he saw the way Eleanor's eyes went wide at the sight of the steak, potatoes, carrots, and fresh bread piled on the plate. Her hand shook so badly when she picked up her fork that she nearly dropped it. "Take your time," he said quietly. "Food's not going anywhere." But even as he said it, he watched her try to cut the steak and saw her hands trembling so violently that the knife skittered across the plate. Frustration and humiliation colored her cheeks, and she set down the utensils with a soft sound of distress. Preston didn't say anything, just reached across the table and switched their plates, his half-cut steak for her untouched one. Then he proceeded to cut the meat into small, manageable pieces before switching the plates back. Eleanor stared at the prepared food, and he saw her throat work as she swallowed hard. "Thank you," she whispered. She ate slowly at first, as if her body had forgotten what to do with food. But as the first few bites hit her empty stomach, something changed. Preston watched as color began to return to her face, as the glazed look in her eyes faded to something more aware. She didn't eat like someone who was starving, gulping and choking. Instead, she ate with the careful precision of someone who'd been raised with manners but whose body was screaming for sustenance. He worked on his own meal, giving her space and time. The restaurant hummed with quiet conversation around them, the clink of silverware on china, the low murmur of respectable society going about its business. Through the window, he could see the sun beginning its descent toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. Eleanor had made her way through half the steak and most of the potatoes when she finally set down her fork and met his eyes. Some of the fear had receded, replaced by a wariness that seemed more thoughtful than panicked. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. "You don't know me." Preston considered the question, really considered it. He could have given her a dozen easy answers, the kind of things a gentleman was supposed to say. Instead, he told her the truth. "My sister was 19 when she ran off with a gambler from San Francisco," he said. "By the time we found her, she'd been abandoned in Sacramento with no money, no food, and no way home. A stranger helped her, bought her a train ticket back to Montana. I never got to thank him." He paused, his coffee cup halfway to his lips. "Maybe this is me paying that debt forward." Eleanor absorbed this in silence, her green eyes searching his face again. Whatever she saw there seemed to ease something in her because her shoulders, which had been up around her ears, finally lowered a fraction. "I was supposed to be married," she said quietly, "to a man named Richard Sawyer. He owned a dry goods store in Portland. We'd been courting for 6 months, and he seemed kind, respectable. My father approved the match." Preston heard the past tense, the way her voice went flat when she said the man's name. "He wasn't kind," Preston guessed. "No." Eleanor picked up her coffee cup, using it as something to occupy her shaking hands. "The first time he hit me was 2 weeks before the wedding. Blamed it on drink, swore it would never happen again. I believed him. I wanted to believe him. She fell silent, and Preston didn't push. He'd heard stories like this before, knew how they usually ended. The second time was worse, Eleanor continued, her voice distant now, like she was recounting something that had happened to someone else. He broke my wrist, told everyone I'd fallen down the stairs. My father believed him. Everyone believed him. And I realized that if I married Richard, that would be my life. His punching bag, his property, until he finally hit me hard enough to kill me. So you ran. 2 weeks ago, took what money I could and bought a train ticket east. But Richard found out. He followed me. By the time I got to Spokane, he'd wired ahead, told the sheriff I was a thief, that I'd stolen from him. I've been hiding ever since, too afraid to go to the law, too afraid to stay in one place. Preston's jaw tightened. The gunshot earlier. Was that him? Eleanor's cup rattled in its saucer as she set it down. One of the men he hired, he's offering a reward for my return, $200. In a town like this, that's enough for half the men to start looking. $200. It was a considerable sum, enough to make even honest men consider compromising their principles. Preston thought about the woman across from him, barely holding herself together. 3 days without food and running on nothing but fear. You can't stay here, he said. Spokane's too small, too connected to the rail line. He'll find you. I know. Eleanor's voice cracked, and she pressed her lips together hard. I just don't know where else to go. I have no family except my father, and he made it clear whose side he's on. I have no money, no skills beyond needlework and keeping house. I'm trapped. The despair in her voice cut through Preston like a knife. He thought about his ranch in Montana, the small spread he'd built with his own 2 hands over the past 5 years. It wasn't much, just a cabin, a barn, and enough grazing land for a modest herd. But it was his, clear and free. And it was far enough from Portland that a man like Richard Sawyer would have a hell of a time finding anyone there. Come with me, he said. Eleanor's head jerked up, eyes wide. What? Back to Montana. I've got a ranch near Helena. It's small, nothing fancy, but it's remote. You could stay there, at least until this blows over, until you figure out what you want to do next. I can't. But even as she said it, he could see the hope flickering in her eyes, desperate and bright. I don't know you. This morning I didn't even know you existed. That's fair, Preston acknowledged, but you trusted me enough to let me buy you dinner, and I'm guessing your options are pretty limited right now. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. Through the window, the sun had dipped below the mountains, and the street lamps were being lit, small pools of yellow light pushing back the gathering darkness. What would you expect from me? She asked finally, and there was a world of meaning in that question. Preston met her eyes steadily. I'd expect you to earn your keep, cooking, maybe some mending. I'm not much of a hand in the kitchen, and my clothes could use someone who knows the business end of a needle. In exchange, you'd have a roof over your head, food, and safety. That's all. That's all, Eleanor repeated, testing the words like they might be a trap. That's all, Preston confirmed. I'm not Richard Sawyer, Miss Taylor. I don't hit women, and I don't force anyone to do anything they don't want to do. You'd be an employee, nothing more. And if you decide Montana's not for you, I'll stake you enough money to go wherever you want to go. She studied him for so long that Preston began to wonder if he'd overstepped, if his offer had sounded too good to be true and therefore suspect. But finally, Eleanor drew in a shaky breath and nodded. All right, she whispered. I'll come with you to Montana. Relief surged through Preston, though he couldn't quite explain why. He'd done his good deed, offered shelter to someone who needed it. That should have been enough. But as he looked at Eleanor Taylor, at the fragile hope beginning to kindle in her green eyes, he felt something shift in his chest, something he wasn't quite ready to name. We'll leave at first light, he said. I need to collect my pay from the buyer and get supplies. You should stay out of sight until then. Is there somewhere safe you can spend the night? Eleanor's face fell. I've been sleeping in an abandoned shed behind the livery. The owner doesn't know I'm there. The thought of her huddled in some cold, dark shed made Preston's decision easy. Get your things. You're staying at the hotel tonight. I'll get you a room. I can't let you do that. You've already done so much. Miss Taylor, you're about to spend 2 weeks on the trail with me, sleeping on the ground and eating beans out of a can. One night in a real bed isn't going to break me. The ghost of a smile touched Eleanor's lips. the first he'd seen from her. It transformed her face, hinting at the woman she might be when she wasn't running scared. They finished their meal in more comfortable silence, and Preston paid the bill with another flash of gold that made the proprietor practically bow them out of the restaurant. The evening air was cool after the warmth of the dining room, and Preston offered Eleanor his arm again as they made their way to the Grand Hotel. The clerk eyed Eleanor's disheveled appearance with poorly concealed disdain, but Preston's money spoke louder than any objections. He secured her a room on the second floor, far enough from the street that she'd hear anyone coming up the stairs. "Lock the door," he instructed as he handed her the key. "Don't open it for anyone but me. I'll knock 3 times, pause, then twice more. Got it?" Eleanor nodded, her fingers closing around the key like a lifeline. 3 times, pause, twice more. "I'll be back before dawn. Be ready to ride." He started to turn away, but her hand caught his sleeve. When he looked back, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Thank you," she said. "I know I already said it, but thank you. I was starting to think there were no good men left in the world." Preston covered her hand with his, a brief squeeze of reassurance. "Get some rest, Miss Taylor. Tomorrow's going to be a long day." He waited until he heard the lock click into place before heading back down the stairs. The night clerk barely glanced at him as he headed out into the street, his mind already running through everything he needed to do before dawn. First stop was the Silver Dollar Saloon, where his buyer kept an office in the back. Marcus Flynn was a cattle broker who'd made his fortune supplying beef to the mining camps scattered throughout the Montana and Idaho territories. He was shrewd but honest, and when Preston knocked on his door, he was greeted with a hearty welcome. "Northwood, been expecting you. Come in, come in." The office was cramped and smelled of cigars and whiskey, but Flynn's handshake was firm and his eyes were clear. They spent 20 minutes going over the final tally, confirming the head count and quality of the cattle Preston had delivered. When Flynn finally counted out the payment in gold and silver, it was exactly what they'd agreed upon, not $1 more or less. "Pleasure doing business with you," Flynn said. "You bring me cattle like that again, I'll pay the same rate." "I'll keep that in mind," Preston replied, tucking the money into his inside coat pocket. Back on the street, he made his way to the general store, which stayed open late to accommodate the miners and ranch hands who worked long hours. He bought supplies for the trail, enough food for 2 people for 2 weeks, plus coffee, ammunition, and a small tent that would provide Eleanor with some privacy. The storekeeper, a talkative man named Henderson, tried to engage him in conversation, but Preston kept his answers short and his business private. His last stop was the livery, where he checked on his horse and arranged to buy a second mount. The stablemaster had a sturdy bay mare that looked like she had good trail sense, and after some haggling, they settled on a fair price. Preston also bought a lady's saddle, used but well-maintained, and made arrangements to pick up both horses before dawn. By the time he made it back to his own room at a boarding house on the edge of town, it was past midnight. He should have been exhausted, should have fallen into bed and slept like the dead. Instead, he found himself lying awake, staring at the ceiling and thinking about green eyes and trembling hands. Eleanor Taylor was trouble. He knew that. A woman running from a rich, angry man was about the worst kind of complication a lone cowboy could take on. But Preston had never been particularly good at taking the easy path. His father used to say he had too much of his mother in him, too much compassion for strays and lost causes. Maybe that was true. Or maybe he just couldn't stomach the thought of leaving her to fend for herself. He rose before the sun, splashing water on his face from the basin and dressing in the pre-dawn darkness. The boarding house was silent as he gathered his gear and slipped out into the street. Spokane was just beginning to stir, smoke rising from a few chimneys, a rooster crowing in the distance. The livery was open, the stablemaster already at work mucking out stalls. Preston saddled both horses, loading his supplies onto his own mount, and leaving the bay mare light except for Eleanor's small pack and the tent. By the time he led both horses to the hotel, the sky had lightened to pearl gray in the east. He left the horses tied at the rail and climbed the stairs to the second floor, finding Eleanor's door and knocking the pattern he had told her. 3 times, pause, twice more. The door opened almost immediately, and Eleanor stood in the doorway wearing the same dress as yesterday, but looking somehow more put together. She'd washed her face and hands, pinned her hair back in a neat bun, and the wild, hunted look had receded from her eyes. She held a small carpetbag, everything she owned in the world, he guessed. "Ready?" he asked. Ready, she confirmed. They made their way down the back stairs and out to where the horses waited. Preston showed Eleanor how to adjust the stirrups on her saddle, then helped her mount. She sat the horse well, he noticed, with the ease of someone who'd ridden before. "We'll take the north road out of town," he said, swinging up onto his own mount. "It's less traveled, less chance of running into anyone." Eleanor nodded, her hands tight on the reins. As they rode out of Spokane, the sun finally broke over the horizon, painting the landscape in shades of gold and amber. The road climbed steadily into the pine-covered hills, and with each mile they put between themselves and the town, Preston felt Eleanor relax a fraction more. They rode in silence for the first few hours, the only sounds the creak of leather, the jingle of tack, and the steady rhythm of hoofbeats. The morning air was crisp and clean, scented with pine and the last of the summer wildflowers that dotted the meadows they passed through. Around mid-morning, Preston called a halt near a stream that burbled down from the mountains. The horses drank, while Eleanor stretched her legs, wincing slightly. "Been a while since you rode?" Preston asked. "A few years. My mother used to take me riding on Sunday afternoons before she died." Eleanor's voice was soft with memory. "I'd forgotten how much I missed it." Preston handed her a canteen and a piece of jerky from his supplies. "We'll take it easy today. Build up your endurance. It's about 300 miles to Helena. If we make good time and the weather holds, we can do it in 10 to 12 days. That's a long time to be on the trail." "It is," Preston agreed. "But Montana's worth it. Mountains so tall they scrape the sky, valleys so green they hurt your eyes, rivers full of trout and forests full of elk. It's God's country, Miss Taylor." The way he said it, with such quiet conviction, made Eleanor look at him more closely. In the morning light, she could see details she'd missed in the restaurant's dim interior. Preston Northwood was probably 27 or 28, with sun-weathered skin and deep brown eyes that held both kindness and steel. His jaw was strong beneath a few days' worth of stubble, and his hands, when he'd helped her mount, had been calloused but gentle. "You really love it there," she said. "I do. Built that ranch from nothing, cleared the land myself, raised the cabin log by log. Every inch of it is mine, earned with my own sweat. That means something." Eleanor heard the pride in his voice and felt a pang of something she couldn't quite name. She'd never owned anything, never had anything that was truly hers. Everything in her life had belonged to her father first, then would have belonged to Richard. The idea of owning something, of having a place that was hers alone, was so foreign it might as well have been a fairy tale. They mounted again and continued north, the road winding through increasingly rugged country. By noon, they'd left the last signs of civilization behind, just the trail and the endless forest pressing in on either side. Preston kept them moving at a steady pace, not too fast, but not dawdling either, and Eleanor found herself falling into the rhythm of travel. When they stopped for lunch, Preston built a small fire and made coffee, strong and black, and they ate more jerky with hard biscuits that Eleanor had to soften in the coffee before she could chew them. It wasn't much, but after 3 days of nothing, it tasted like a feast. "Tell me about your ranch," Eleanor said, as they rested in the shade of a towering pine. "What's it like?" Preston leaned back against the tree trunk, his hat tipped down to shade his eyes. "Got about 300 acres, most of it grazing land. The cabin's small, just 2 rooms, but it's solid. Built it to last. There's a creek that runs through the north pasture, never goes dry even in the hottest summers. Good water, cold and clear. Do you have cattle?" "About 50 head right now. I'm building the herd slowly, being careful not to overgraze. Got a few horses too, besides the one I'm riding, and chickens, though the foxes keep getting them." Eleanor smiled at that, picturing this serious, capable man chasing chickens and cursing foxes. "It sounds peaceful." "It is. Sometimes I go days without seeing another soul. Some men would go crazy with the solitude, but I like it. Like being able to hear myself think." "I think I'd like that too," Eleanor said quietly. "The quiet, the space. I've spent my whole life in cities, always surrounded by people, always having to watch what I say and do. I think I'd like to just be alone for a while." Preston pushed his hat back and looked at her. "Montana's good for that, good for healing." The word hung in the air between them, acknowledgement of all the things they hadn't talked about, all the wounds, physical and otherwise, that Eleanor was carrying. She felt her throat tighten and looked away, focusing on the coffee in her cup. They rode until late afternoon, when Preston found a good spot to make camp near a small lake surrounded by aspens. While he tended the horses and gathered firewood, Eleanor set up the tent he'd bought, fumbling with the poles until she figured out the system. By the time Preston had the fire going, she'd created a respectable shelter. "Not bad for a city girl," he said with a hint of approval. "I'm a quick learner." Dinner was beans and bacon, cooked in a cast-iron skillet over the open fire, with more of the hard biscuits and coffee. It wasn't fancy, but Eleanor ate every bite, her appetite returning now that her body was beginning to trust it would be fed regularly. As the sun set, painting the lake in shades of orange and purple, they sat by the fire and talked. Preston told her about Montana, about the cattle drives and the harsh winters, about the time a grizzly bear had destroyed his chicken coop, and he'd tracked it for 2 days before giving up. Eleanor told him about her childhood in Portland, about her mother's garden and the books she'd loved to read, about the dreams she'd once had of becoming a teacher. "What stopped you?" Preston asked. "My father. He didn't think it was appropriate for his daughter to work. Said my job was to marry well and run a household." Eleanor's voice went flat. "I tried to argue, but he wouldn't hear it. And then he introduced me to Richard, and that was that. You could still teach. Maybe not in a formal school, but there are ranch families scattered all over Montana. Lots of kids who don't get proper schooling because the nearest town is 50 miles away. A woman with learning could make good money as a traveling tutor." The idea settled over Eleanor like a warm blanket. "I never thought of that." "Well, think on it now. You're not trapped anymore, Miss Taylor. You've got options." As the fire burned down to embers, Preston banked it carefully and checked the camp perimeter, while Eleanor retreated to her tent. She lay on her bedroll, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the wilderness, the rustle of leaves and the distant call of an owl. For the first time in weeks, she felt something other than fear. She felt hope. The days fell into a pattern as they traveled north and east into Montana. They rose with the sun, broke camp, and rode until noon. After a brief rest and a cold lunch, they continued until late afternoon, then made camp and ate a hot dinner. The nights grew cooler as they climbed into the mountains, and Eleanor was grateful for the extra blanket Preston had thought to pack. Her body adjusted to the rigors of travel. The trembling in her hands eased and then stopped altogether. Color returned to her face, and she gained back some of the weight she'd lost. More than that, something fundamental shifted inside her. The constant vigilance, the need to look over her shoulder, began to fade. Out here in the wilderness, with miles of empty country in every direction, Richard Sawyer seemed less like an immediate threat, and more like a bad dream receding in daylight. Preston was good company, she discovered. He didn't talk just to fill silence, but when he did speak, it was worth listening to. He knew the names of the plants they passed, which ones were edible and which were poison. He pointed out animal tracks and taught her to read the signs of the forest. And he treated her with a respect she'd never experienced from a man, like her thoughts and opinions actually mattered. One evening, about a week into their journey, they made camp beside a river that roared with snowmelt from the mountains. Eleanor had washed their dishes and was hanging them to dry when Preston returned from checking on the horses. "Storm coming," he said, eyeing the clouds building to the west. "Could be a big one. We should prepare for rain." They worked together to secure the camp, tying down the tent with extra stakes and covering their supplies with a canvas tarp. The storm hit just after dark, a deluge that turned the world into a curtain of water. Lightning split the sky, and thunder rolled through the mountains like cannon fire. Eleanor huddled in her tent, trying not to flinch at each boom of thunder. She'd never liked storms, and out here, with nothing between her and the raw power of nature, it was terrifying. She was on the verge of real panic when she heard Preston's voice outside. "Miss Taylor, you all right in there?" "I'm fine," she called back, but her voice shook. There was a pause, then, "Mind if I sit just outside? I don't like leaving the supplies unguarded in weather like this." Eleanor knew it was an excuse, knew the supplies were fine under the tarp, but she also knew he was offering her comfort without making her feel foolish. That would be fine. She could hear him settling down just outside the tent flap, a solid presence between her and the storm. Somehow, knowing he was there made the thunder less frightening, the lightning less overwhelming. She found herself drifting off to sleep despite the weather, lulled by the knowledge that she wasn't alone. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean and sparkling. They broke camp and continued east, climbing higher into the mountains. The landscape changed, becoming more rugged, more dramatic. Pine forests gave way to alpine meadows where wildflowers bloomed in profusion, and the peaks around them wore caps of eternal snow. "We're in Montana now," Preston said, as they crested a pass and looked down into a valley that stretched to the horizon. "Helena's another 3 days northeast." Eleanor looked out at the vast landscape before them and felt her chest expand with something she'd never felt before: freedom. True, unlimited freedom. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "Wait until you see the ranch." They descended into the valley, following a river that wound through stands of cottonwood and willow. That night, they camped in a meadow where elk grazed in the distance, their bugling calls echoing off the mountains. Preston made a stew from dried meat and wild onions he'd gathered, and they ate watching the sun set behind the peaks. "Can I ask you something?" Eleanor said, as they lingered by the fire. "Sure. Why haven't you married? A man with his own land, a good reputation, you must have had offers." Preston was quiet for so long, she thought he wasn't going to answer. Finally, he said, "I was engaged once, a girl named Sarah from back in Missouri. We were going to get married, move west together, build a life. Then she met a banker who could offer her a house in town, fancy dresses, a life of ease. She chose him. I'm sorry," he shrugged. "I was hurt at the time, angry, but looking back, she did me a favor. She would have hated ranch life, hated the isolation and the hard work. Better to find that out before we were married. So you've been alone ever since." "Mostly. There aren't many unmarried women in Montana, and the ones that are tend to get snapped up quick. Besides, I'm particular. I want someone who can handle the life, who won't wilt at the first hard winter, or run off the first time things get tough." Eleanor thought about that, about the kind of woman Preston was describing: strong, resilient, adaptable, a partner, not a decoration. "I think I could handle it," she said quietly. "The ranch life, the winters, all of it." Preston looked at her across the fire, his dark eyes reflecting the flames. "Yeah," he said, "I think you could." Something passed between them in that moment, an acknowledgement of possibility, of potential. Eleanor felt her heart skip, felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire spreading through her chest. She quickly looked away, suddenly shy, but she could feel Preston's gaze on her for a long moment before he turned back to the fire. They reached the outskirts of Helena on the 10th day, but instead of going into town, Preston led them around it, following a series of smaller trails that wound into the foothills. The country here was gentler than the high mountains they had crossed, rolling grassland broken by clusters of pine and stands of aspen. Cattle grazed on distant hillsides, and Eleanor saw her first Montana ranch, a sturdy log house surrounded by outbuildings and corrals. "Not much further now," Preston said, and she could hear the anticipation in his voice. They rode for another hour, following a creek that burbled over smooth stones, and then they crested a rise, and Eleanor saw it. Preston's ranch spread out below them, exactly as he had described it. A log cabin sat on a slight rise, smoke curling from its chimney. A barn and several smaller outbuildings were arranged around a central corral, and beyond it all, green pasture stretched to the tree line, where cattle grazed peacefully. "Home," Preston said simply. They rode down into the valley, and as they approached the cabin, a door opened and a young man stepped out, rifle in hand. When he saw Preston, his face split into a grin. "About time you got back. I was starting to think you'd gotten yourself killed. Takes more than a cattle drive to kill me, Tommy." Preston dismounted and clasped the young man's hand. "Everything all right here?" "Quiet as a church. Lost 2 chickens to a fox, but other than that, no trouble." Tommy's eyes slid to Eleanor, curiosity evident. "Tommy, this is Miss Eleanor Taylor. She'll be staying on as housekeeper and cook. Miss Taylor, this is Tommy Red Hawk. He helps me run the place." Tommy was young, maybe 20, with black hair and dark eyes that spoke of native heritage. He touched his hat respectfully. "Madam, please call me Eleanor." "Tommy's been looking after things while I was gone," Preston explained. "He's got a gift with horses, best I've ever seen." Tommy ducked his head at the praise, pleased but embarrassed. "I'll get these horses put up for you. You folks look like you could use some rest." Preston helped Eleanor down from her horse, and she stood for a moment, getting her land legs back. Her whole body ached from 10 days in the saddle, but it was a good ache, the ache of honest exertion. The cabin was exactly as Preston had described it. The main room served as kitchen, dining, and living area, with a large fireplace dominating one wall. A door led to the single bedroom, which Preston immediately offered to Eleanor. "I'll sleep out here," he said. "There's a cot I can set up. I can't take your bedroom." "Miss Taylor, you're not taking anything. I'm giving it. Besides, you need privacy more than I do." Eleanor wanted to argue, but she was too tired and too grateful. The bedroom was simple but clean, with a real bed covered in quilts and a window that looked out on the mountains. It was more than she'd hoped for, more than she'd dreamed of during those desperate days in Spokane. That evening, she made dinner for the three of them, venison steaks from Tommy's hunting, and vegetables from the root cellar. It felt strange but right to be cooking in Preston's kitchen, to be setting his table and serving his food. Tommy ate with the enthusiasm of a young man who'd been cooking for himself too long, and Preston's quiet satisfaction was more rewarding than any lavish praise could have been. After dinner, Tommy headed back to the small cabin he occupied near the barn, and Eleanor and Preston were left alone for the first time in days. She washed the dishes while he banked the fire, and the domesticity of it all struck her suddenly. This could be her life, this cabin, this valley, this man. The possibility of it bloomed in her chest like a flower opening to the sun. "Thank you," she said, drying her hands on a towel, "for everything, for saving me, for bringing me here, for giving me a chance." Preston straightened from the fire, his face half in shadow. "You don't have to thank me. You've earned your place here. Still, I want you to know, I won't let you down. I know you won't." They stood there in the firelight, and Eleanor felt the air between them change, charged with something unnamed. Preston took a step toward her, then stopped, uncertainty crossing his face. "Eleanor," he said, and the way he said her name, soft and careful, made her breath catch. "These past 10 days, traveling with you, getting to know you, it's been good, really good. For me, too," she whispered. "I know this is fast, maybe too fast, but I feel like I should be honest with you about how I'm starting to feel." Eleanor's heart hammered in her chest. "I'd like you to be honest." Preston took another step, close enough now that she could see the gold flecks in his brown eyes, could smell the wood smoke and leather that clung to his clothes. "I'm falling for you, Eleanor Taylor, have been since the moment I saw you in that alley, maybe before, and I know that's crazy. No, I barely know you, but there it is." Eleanor couldn't breathe, couldn't think. All she could do was feel, the rush of emotion that swept through her at his words. Joy, fear, hope, terror, all tangled together in a knot she couldn't unravel. "I'm scared," she admitted. "The last man I trusted hurt me, almost destroyed me. I'm not him." Preston's voice was fierce. "I will never be him. I would cut off my own hand before I raised it to you. I know, I do know that. But knowing it here," she touched her head, "and feeling it here," she touched her heart, "are two different things. Then take your time. I'm not going anywhere, and neither are you. We've got all the time in the world." Eleanor looked up at him, at this good man who'd saved her life and asked for nothing in return, who'd treated her with respect and kindness when she'd had every reason to expect the worst. She thought about the past 10 days, about the easy companionship they had developed, the way he made her laugh and made her feel safe. "I'm falling for you too," she said. "I think I have been for a while, and that terrifies me." Preston reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and cupped her face in his calloused hand. "We'll be terrified together then." And then he kissed her, soft and sweet and gentle, a question more than a demand. Eleanor's eyes fluttered closed, and she leaned into him, her hands coming up to rest on his chest. She could feel his heart beating strong and steady beneath her palm, an anchor in a world that had been spinning for too long. When they finally pulled apart, Preston rested his forehead against hers, his breath mingling with her own. "We'll take this slow," he promised. "As slow as you need?" "Okay," Eleanor whispered. "Slow." But as she lay in bed that night, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch settling around her, Eleanor knew the truth. This thing between them, whatever it was, wasn't going to be slow at all. It was like a wildfire, burning bright and fast, consuming everything in its path. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of getting burned. The next weeks fell into a rhythm that felt like coming home. Eleanor rose early each morning and made breakfast for Preston and Tommy, hearty meals of eggs and bacon and fresh biscuits that made Tommy groan with pleasure. After breakfast, Preston would head out to work the ranch, mending fences or moving cattle or breaking horses, while Eleanor tackled the housework. She discovered she liked the physical labor, the way it tired her body and left her too exhausted to think. She scrubbed floors and washed clothes and tended the small vegetable garden that had been neglected during Preston's absence. Tommy's mother, who lived on the nearby Flathead Reservation, came by one day with seeds and advice, and Eleanor spent happy hours coaxing tomatoes and squash and beans from the rich Montana soil. In the evenings, she and Preston would sit on the porch and watch the sun set behind the mountains. They talked about everything and nothing, sharing pieces of their pasts and dreams for the future. Preston told her about his childhood in Missouri, about the father who died when he was 15 and the responsibility that had fallen on his shoulders. Eleanor told him about her mother, about the books they'd read together and the songs they'd sung. Slowly, carefully, they built something between them, trust first and foremost. Eleanor learned that Preston was a man of his word, that when he said he'd never hurt her, he meant it absolutely. She watched the way he handled the animals, patient and firm, but never cruel. She saw how he treated Tommy, with respect and fairness, despite the young man's mixed heritage that would have made him a target in town, and she began to believe that maybe, just maybe, she'd found someone she could trust with her heart. Preston, for his part, was captivated by Eleanor in a way that surprised him. He loved her quick mind and sharp wit, the way she could make him laugh with a dry observation about the chickens' personalities or Tommy's eating habits. He loved her strength, the resilience that had carried her through hardship and brought her out the other side. And he loved the softness underneath, the vulnerability she was beginning to trust him with. One afternoon in late September, about 6 weeks after they had arrived at the ranch, Preston came in from the north pasture to find Eleanor in the kitchen, up to her elbows in flour. She was making bread, and the smell of yeast and baking filled the cabin with warmth. "Smells amazing," he said, hanging his hat by the door. Eleanor looked up, flour on her nose, and smiled. "Tommy's mother taught me a recipe. Said it was what her own mother used to make." Preston watched her work the dough, her movements confident and sure. She'd gained weight since leaving Spokane, and her face had filled out, making her even more beautiful. Her hair, which she'd let down while she worked, fell in waves down her back, catching the afternoon light. "Eleanor," he said, and something in his voice made her look up. "I need to go into Helena tomorrow. Get supplies before winter sets in. I was hoping you'd come with me." She stiffened slightly, and he saw the old fear flicker in her eyes. "Will it be safe?" "I think so. Helena's a big enough town that we can get in and out without drawing attention. And you need proper winter clothes. Montana winters aren't like anything you've experienced in Portland." Eleanor considered this, her hands still working the dough. Finally, she nodded. "All right, I'll come." They left early the next morning, riding the 12 miles into Helena under a sky so blue it hurt to look at. The town had grown considerably since Preston's last visit, new buildings springing up along Last Chance Gulch, the main street. They tied their horses outside a general store that advertised dry goods and provisions. Inside, Eleanor marveled at the array of goods, fabrics, and tools and foods from around the world. Preston steered her toward the women's section, where bolts of wool and flannel were stacked alongside ready-made coats and boots. "Pick what you need," he said, "and don't worry about the cost." Eleanor hesitated, unused to spending someone else's money, but Preston's encouraging nod made her reach for a bolt of dark blue wool. Together, they selected fabric for 2 warm dresses, a heavy coat lined with sheepskin, sturdy boots, and thick stockings. The proprietor, a cheerful woman named Mrs. Henderson, measured Eleanor and promised to have the coat ready by the end of the day. While they waited, Preston took Eleanor to lunch at a restaurant that served the best elk steak she'd ever tasted. They were just finishing their meal when a man approached their table, tall and well-dressed with a politician's smile. "Preston Northwood, as I live and breathe, heard you were back in town." Preston stood and shook the man's hand, though Eleanor noticed his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "Sheriff Morrison, good to see you. And who's this lovely lady?" Morrison's eyes slid to Eleanor, assessing. "Miss Eleanor Taylor. She's working as my housekeeper." "Is that so?" Morrison's gaze lingered on Eleanor in a way that made her skin crawl. "Well, welcome to Helena, Miss Taylor." If you ever need anything, anything at all, you just come see me. Thank you, Eleanor murmured, keeping her eyes down. After Morrison left, Preston sat back down with a scowl. Don't trust that man. He's more interested in lining his pockets than keeping the peace. They collected Eleanor's coat and the rest of their supplies, loaded everything onto the horses, and started the ride home. Eleanor was quiet, the encounter with the sheriff having stirred up old fears. He reminded me of Richard, she said finally. The way he looked at me, like I was something to be owned. Preston's jaw tightened. You're not property, Eleanor. You don't belong to anyone but yourself. I know. It's just hard sometimes to feel that, to believe it. They rode in silence for a while, the afternoon sun warm on their backs. Finally, Preston said, I meant what I said, about how I feel, about us. I know you did. Do you feel the same, or am I hoping for something that's not there? Eleanor reined in her horse, and Preston stopped beside her. They were alone on the trail, surrounded by nothing but pine forest and blue sky. She looked at him, this man who'd saved her life and shown her what kindness looked like, and felt her heart swell with certainty. I love you, she said. I think I've loved you since that night in the restaurant when you cut my steak for me. I was just too scared to admit it. Preston dismounted in one smooth motion and reached up to help her down. When her feet touched the ground, he pulled her into his arms, holding her close. I love you too, he murmured into her hair, more than I thought it was possible to love someone. Eleanor tilted her face up, and he kissed her, deep and thorough, pouring all his feelings into the touch. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathing hard. Marry me, Preston said. Not today, not tomorrow, whenever you're ready, but marry me, Eleanor. Build a life with me here. Tears spilled down Eleanor's cheeks, but they were happy tears, joyful tears. Yes, yes, I'll marry you. They stood there in the middle of the trail, holding each other as the sun moved across the sky, and the wind whispered through the pines. Eleanor felt something settle in her chest, a peace she'd never known before. This was home. Preston was home. They were married in late October, just before the first snow. Tommy rode to the reservation and brought back his mother and several aunts, who helped Eleanor prepare for the ceremony. Mrs. Henderson from town came too, bringing fabric for a wedding dress that she and Eleanor sewed together in a frenzy of activity. The ceremony was held in the cabin, with the circuit preacher presiding and Tommy standing up as Preston's best man. Eleanor wore her new dress, cream-colored wool embroidered with blue flowers, and carried wildflowers that Tommy's mother had preserved. Preston wore his best suit, cleaned and pressed, and when he saw Eleanor walk toward him, his eyes went bright with emotion. They spoke their vows in front of the fireplace, promising to love and cherish, to stand by each other through whatever came. When Preston slipped a simple gold band on Eleanor's finger, she thought her heart might burst from happiness. The celebration afterward was simple but joyful. Tommy's family brought food and music, and they danced in the clearing outside the cabin as the sun set. Eleanor, who'd been taught formal dances in Portland's ballrooms, learned the steps to traditional Salish songs, and laughed as Tommy's youngest cousin tried to teach Preston to keep the beat. When the guests finally departed and they were alone, Preston carried Eleanor over the threshold of their cabin, her cabin now, their home. He set her down gently, and she reached up to cup his face. I love you, she said, my husband. I love you, he replied, my wife. They made love that night for the first time, slow and tender and full of discovery. Preston was patient and gentle, always asking, always making sure she was all right. And Eleanor, who'd been taught to fear a man's touch, found joy in the intimacy, found pleasure in the giving and receiving. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the big bed, watching the firelight dance on the ceiling. Are you happy? Preston asked. Eleanor thought about the question, really thought about it. She thought about the terrified woman who'd stumbled out of a Spokane alley, about the long journey across Montana, about the home she'd found and the man she'd found it with. I'm happy, she said, happier than I ever thought I could be. Winter came to Montana with a vengeance that year, snow piling up in drifts taller than a man. The temperatures plummeted, and the wind howled down from the mountains with teeth of ice. But inside the cabin, Eleanor and Preston stayed warm and safe, cocooned in their own little world. The work didn't stop because of the weather. Preston still had to tend the cattle, breaking ice on the water troughs and hauling hay out to the fields. Eleanor kept the home fires burning, literally and figuratively, cooking hearty meals and making sure Preston came back to warmth and comfort at the end of each long day. Tommy moved into the small room off the barn for the winter, closer to the animals and able to respond quickly if there was trouble. He joined them for dinner most nights, and Eleanor came to think of him as the younger brother she'd never had. In January, a letter arrived from Portland. Eleanor stared at it for a long time before opening it, her heart hammering. It was from her father's lawyer, informing her that Richard Sawyer had been killed in a drunken brawl 3 weeks before Christmas. The charges against her had been dropped, and she was free to return to Portland if she wished. Eleanor read the letter twice, then walked to the fireplace and dropped it into the flames. Preston, who'd been watching from the table, came to stand beside her. "Everything all right?" "Richard's dead," she said. "I'm free." Preston wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on top of her head. "You were always free, Eleanor, from the moment you decided to run." "I know, but this makes it official." She turned in his arms, looking up at him. "I don't want to go back to Portland. I don't want anything from my old life. This is my life now. You're my life." "Good," Preston said, and kissed her. "Because I'm never letting you go." Spring came eventually, as it always did in Montana. The snow melted, revealing green grass and wildflowers. The cattle grew fat on the new growth, and Eleanor's garden exploded with life. She discovered she had a talent for growing things, and by summer, they had more vegetables than they could eat. In August, Eleanor realized she'd missed her monthly courses. The realization filled her with a complex mix of emotions, joy, and fear tangled together. When she told Preston, he picked her up and spun her around, whooping with delight. "A baby," he said, setting her down gently, his hands going immediately to her still flat stomach. "Our baby." Eleanor placed her hands over his. "Are you ready to be a father? Are you ready to be a mother?" She thought about it, really thought about it. A year ago, the idea would have terrified her. But now, with Preston beside her, and a home of her own, and a life she'd built with her own 2 hands, it felt right. "Yes," she said, "I think I am." The pregnancy was easier than she'd feared. She stayed active through the fall, working in the garden and helping with the lighter ranch chores. Tommy's mother came by regularly, bringing herbs and advice, teaching Eleanor the old ways of preparing for childbirth. Preston was attentive to the point of being overprotective, constantly asking if she was all right, if she needed anything. Eleanor found it endearing even when it was exasperating. Their son was born in March of 1884, during a late-season blizzard that howled around the cabin like a living thing. Tommy's mother served as midwife, her capable hands and calm presence guiding Eleanor through the long hours of labor. Preston paced outside the bedroom door, wearing a path in the wooden floor, until finally, just before dawn, he heard the thin wail of a newborn. Tommy's mother opened the door, smiling. "You have a son, strong and healthy." Preston rushed into the room to find Eleanor propped up in bed, exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in soft blankets. She looked up at him, with tears streaming down her face. "Preston, meet your son." He approached slowly, almost reverently, and looked down at the tiny face peeking out from the blankets. The baby had a shock of dark hair and eyes that would probably turn brown like his father's. Preston felt something shift in his chest, a love so fierce and immediate it took his breath away. "He's perfect," Preston whispered. "You're both perfect." They named him James Preston Northwood, after Preston's father. Jamie, as he quickly became known, was a good baby, easygoing and quick to smile. He grew like a weed, and before Eleanor knew it, he was crawling, then walking, then running all over the ranch with Tommy's patient supervision. Life settled into a new rhythm, busier and louder, but infinitely richer. Preston expanded the herd, and the ranch prospered. Eleanor started teaching reading and arithmetic to a handful of children from neighboring ranches, holding classes in the cabin twice a week. The extra money was nice, but more than that, she loved seeing the children's faces light up when they mastered a new skill. Jamie was 3 when Eleanor found herself pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy was harder, and she was confined to bed rest for the last 2 months. Preston hired a girl from town to help with the housework, and Tommy's mother practically moved in, making sure Eleanor rested and ate properly. Their daughter was born in November, a tiny thing with her mother's green eyes and auburn hair. They named her Rose, and she was as different from Jamie as night from day. Where Jamie had been easy, Rose was demanding. Where Jamie had been placid, Rose was fierce. But they loved her with the same intensity they loved her brother. The years rolled by, marked by the changing seasons and the growing children. Jamie started helping his father with the ranch work as soon as he was old enough, showing the same patience with animals that Preston had. Rose, true to form, declared she wanted to be a teacher like her mother and would sit in on Eleanor's lessons, soaking up knowledge like a sponge. In 1890, when Jamie was 6 and Rose was 3, Preston came home one day with news. The railroad was extending a spur line that would come within 10 miles of their ranch. It would mean easier access to markets, better prices for their cattle. "We could expand," Preston said over dinner. "Really build this place into something substantial. Leave Jamie a legacy." Eleanor reached across the table and took his hand. "We've already built something substantial. This family, this home, this life. That's our legacy." Preston smiled, that slow smile that still made her heart skip even after all these years. "You're right, but we can build on it, make it even better." And they did. Over the next decade, the ranch grew and prospered. They added more land, more cattle, and eventually more children. A second son, Thomas, was born in 1892, named after Tommy Redhawk, who'd become family in all but blood. And finally, in 1895, twin girls, Alice and Emma, who kept everyone on their toes with their mischief and energy. The cabin, too small for their growing family, was expanded. Preston and Jamie built an addition, adding bedrooms and a proper dining room. Eleanor planted flowers around the porch, creating a garden that became the talk of the county. Through it all, through the hard years and the good years, the droughts and the blizzards, the births and the losses, Eleanor and Preston stood together. Their love, which had started with a trembling woman and a kind cowboy in a Spokane alley, had grown into something deep and unshakable. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Preston took Eleanor riding up into the mountains, just the two of them. They left the children with Tommy, who had married and had children of his own by then, and rode to a high meadow that overlooked the entire valley. "Remember when we first came here?" Preston asked as they sat together watching the sun set. "You were so scared, so fragile." Eleanor leaned against him, their bodies fitting together after years of practice. "I wasn't fragile. I was broken. There's a difference." And now? She thought about her life, about the children playing at home, about the students she taught and the garden she tended, about this man beside her who'd shown her what love really meant. "Now I'm whole," she said. "You made me whole, Preston Northwood." "No," he said, turning to kiss her forehead. "You made yourself whole. I just gave you a safe place to heal." They sat in the meadow as the stars came out, talking and laughing and remembering. When they finally rode home, it was late, but lights were burning in the windows of their house. Their children ran out to meet them, even the older ones who were almost grown, clamoring for attention and stories. Eleanor looked at her family, at this life she'd built from the ashes of her old one, and felt gratitude so profound it brought tears to her eyes. She thought about that terrified woman in Spokane who'd whispered Tuesday when asked when she'd last eaten. That woman seemed like a stranger now, someone from another lifetime. But she wasn't a stranger. She was Eleanor, just a different version. The version who hadn't yet learned her own strength, who hadn't yet discovered that love could be kind and gentle and true. The version who'd needed a cowboy with dark eyes and a kind heart to show her the way home. As the family settled in for the night, as Preston checked the locks and Eleanor tucked in the youngest children, she sent up a silent prayer of thanks. For the day Preston had ridden into Spokane, for his question about when she'd last eaten, for his kindness in a moment when she'd needed it most. Her hands didn't shake anymore. Her heart didn't race with fear. She slept soundly through the night, secure in the knowledge that she was safe, she was loved, and she was home. Years continued to pass, and the Northwood Ranch became one of the most respected operations in the territory. Jamie grew into a fine young man, eventually marrying a school teacher from Helena, and starting a family of his own on a piece of land Preston deeded to him. Rose, true to her word, became a teacher, and eventually opened a school in town. Thomas took to ranching like a natural, staying on to help Preston run the growing operation. And the twins, Alice and Emma, brought joy and chaos in equal measure before eventually finding their own paths. Through it all, Preston and Eleanor remained each other's anchor. They grew older together, their hair turning gray, their faces gaining lines that spoke of years spent squinting into the sun and laughing together. But the love between them never dimmed. If anything, it grew stronger, deeper, tempered by time and hardship into something unbreakable. On a warm summer evening in 1910, when Preston was 60 and Eleanor was 53, they sat together on their porch watching their grandchildren play in the yard. There were 7 of them now, ranging in age from infant to teenager, and the sound of their laughter filled the valley. "You ever regret it?" Preston asked, reaching for Eleanor's hand. "Leaving everything behind, taking a chance on a stranger?" Eleanor squeezed his fingers, these hands that had worked beside her for nearly 3 decades, that had held her through grief and joy, that had built a life she could never have imagined. "Not for a single moment," she said. "You saved my life that day in Spokane." "You saved mine too," Preston replied. "I just didn't know I needed saving until I met you." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun paint the mountains gold and the children chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. Inside the house, Eleanor could hear her daughters preparing dinner, could smell bread baking and coffee brewing, the sounds and smells of home, of family, of a life well lived. She thought about the girl she'd been, trapped and desperate, and the woman she'd become, strong and free. She thought about the long journey from Spokane to this porch, from fear to love, from despair to joy. And she thought about the cowboy who had asked a simple question that had changed everything. "When did you last eat?" Such a small thing, such a simple kindness. But kindness was never really simple, was it? Kindness was a choice, made moment by moment, day by day. And Preston had chosen kindness that day in the alley, had kept choosing it every day since, until kindness had transformed into love, and love had transformed their lives. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Preston turned to Eleanor and smiled, that same gentle smile that had made her feel safe all those years ago. She smiled back, her heart full to bursting with gratitude and love, and the simple, profound joy of a life shared with someone who truly saw her, truly knew her, and loved her anyway. "I love you," she said, the words as fresh and true as the first time she'd spoken them. "I love you too," Preston replied, his voice rich with emotion. "Yesterday, today, tomorrow, always." And as the night settled over the Montana Valley, over the ranch they had built together and the family they had raised, Eleanor Taylor Northwood knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Home, finally and forever, in every sense of the word. The grandchildren were called in for dinner, and the house filled with noise and warmth and love. Around the long table, 3 generations of Northwoods gathered, passing plates and sharing stories. The kind of ordinary evening that was actually extraordinary in its happiness. Eleanor looked around at all the faces, each one precious, each one a miracle she'd never expected to have. After the meal, after the dishes were washed and the children tucked into bed, Eleanor and Preston walked out to the barn, where Preston wanted to check on a mare who was expecting to foal. The night was clear and cool, the stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. "You know what I think about sometimes?" Eleanor said as they walked arm in arm. "That day in the restaurant. The way my hands were shaking so badly I couldn't cut my steak. I was so ashamed." "You had nothing to be ashamed of," Preston said firmly. "You were starving and scared and doing your best to survive. I know that now, but in that moment, I felt like I'd lost everything, even my dignity. And then you switched our plates, just quietly took care of it without making a big deal. That was the moment I started to trust you, I think. That small act of kindness." Preston stopped walking and turned to face her, cupping her face in his work-roughened hands. "You want to know what I think about? The way you answered when I asked when you'd last eaten. Tuesday. Just that one word, but it told me everything I needed to know. It told me you were honest, that you weren't trying to manipulate me or play on my sympathy. You were just stating a fact, and I knew right then that you were someone special, someone worth saving." "We saved each other," Eleanor said, standing on her toes to kiss him. "That's the real truth of it?" They checked on the mare, who was resting comfortably, then walked back to the house hand in hand. The windows glowed with lamplight, casting golden squares onto the ground. From somewhere inside came the sound of Rose playing the piano, a Chopin nocturne that drifted out into the night like a prayer. This was their legacy, Eleanor thought. Not just the land or the cattle or the buildings, though those mattered, but this family, this love, this proof that broken things could be mended and lost, people could find their way home. That kindness could change a life, and love could heal even the deepest wounds. As they climbed the porch steps, Preston paused and looked out over the valley one more time. It's a good life, isn't it? Eleanor followed his gaze, taking in the moonlit pastures, the dark shapes of sleeping cattle, the mountains rising like sentinels against the star-filled sky. It's a beautiful life, she agreed. The best life, and I get to live it with you. They went inside together, closing the door against the night, and the house settled into peaceful quiet. In the bedroom they had shared for almost 30 years, they prepared for sleep with the easy intimacy of long practice. And as they lay together in the darkness, Eleanor's head on Preston's shoulder, his arm around her waist, both of them drifted off with grateful hearts. The years would continue to pass, bringing both joy and sorrow, as all years do. There would be more grandchildren, eventually great-grandchildren. There would be losses too, as friends and family aged and passed on. But through it all, Preston and Eleanor would face everything together, their love a constant in a changing world. And on quiet evenings, when the work was done and the family gathered, Eleanor would sometimes tell the story of how they met. The younger grandchildren would listen with wide eyes as she described being so hungry. Her hands shook, described the kind cowboy who had asked a simple question and changed her life forever. And she would always end the story the same way. Remember, she'd tell them, kindness matters. A single act of kindness can change someone's world. Your grandfather showed me that. He saved my life with a question and a meal and the willingness to see me as a person worth helping. Never underestimate the power you have to make a difference in someone's life. The children would nod solemnly, taking in the lesson. And Preston, listening from his chair by the fire, would catch Eleanor's eye and smile, that same gentle smile that had made her feel safe all those decades ago. Because that was the real story, the true heart of their life together. Not just the love they'd found, though that was precious beyond measure, but the kindness that had sparked it all, the compassion that had looked at a desperate woman in an alley and seen not a problem or a burden, but a person who needed help. And Preston had helped. Without asking for anything in return, without expecting anything in return, he'd simply done what was right. And in doing so, he'd gained far more than he could have imagined. A wife, a family, a lifetime of love and happiness. As the years wound down and both of them grew old, their bodies less strong but their spirits undimmed, they would look back on that day in Spokane with wonder and gratitude. Such a small thing, such a simple moment. But it had been the beginning of everything that mattered. Preston Northwood had seen a woman's hand shake as she tried to eat. He'd asked a simple question, and she'd whispered a single word in response. Tuesday. From that moment, from that simple exchange, had grown a love story for the ages, a tale of rescue and redemption, of trust rebuilt and hope restored, a story of two broken people who'd found each other at exactly the right moment and built something beautiful together. And they lived it fully, every precious day, until the very end of their lives, together, always together, the way it was meant to be. Their story became family legend, passed down through generations. The great-great-grandchildren who never met them would still hear about Preston and Eleanor, about the cowboy and the woman he saved, about the love that started with a question in a Spokane alley and grew into something that touched countless lives. Because that's what real love does. It spreads, it grows, it touches everyone around it. Preston and Eleanor's love created a family, yes. But more than that, it created a legacy of kindness and compassion that would echo through the decades. Their children learned it, taught it to their children, who taught it to theirs. And somewhere, in the great expanse of time and memory, a woman's hand stopped shaking, a cowboy's question was answered, and two souls found their way home to each other. Forever and always, as it was meant to be from the very beginning. Their story, born of desperation and kindness, grew into something timeless, a reminder that we never know how a single act of compassion might change the world, one life at a time, one heart at a time, one moment at a time. And in the end, that's all any of us can do. Show up with kindness, ask the question, offer the help, and trust that love will find a way just as it found its way to Preston and Eleanor on that long-ago day when he saw her hands shake and knew, without knowing how he knew, that saving her would save him too.